Welcome to our program. We're talking with two of the best, and Dr. Craig Evans from Acadia Divinity College and Dr. Gary Habermas from Liberty University. We're talking about the Gospel of Judas. We're talking about the Da Vinci Code. We're talking about the Jesus Dynasty. We're talking about misquoting Jesus and a few other things here. These are books that have been made into specials on television that you've probably seen. They kind of coincide with the coming out of the Da Vinci Code. And there's one theme, guys, that all of these books agree on, and that is, if you look at the New Testament, Jesus never claimed he was deity. He wasn't God. Da Vinci Code says that was invented later on. And the others just seem to say that he didn't have that kind of a vision for himself, that he was this or that. And I would like to talk about the evidence of where you see that Jesus did claim that he was God. Craig, start us off.
The evidence, I think, is seen very clearly in Jesus' reference to himself as the Son of Man, understood in terms of Daniel 7. And combined with Psalm 110, he says that as Son of Man, who received from God authority and power and the kingdom, he will sit at God's right hand. And the reason I know that that is a claim to his own divinity is because that very passage is talked about rabbis later, and they consider it blasphemous for anyone who appears to be a human to say that he will sit at God's right hand. That is outrageous.
All right, now
Jesus does.
Now you're talking right down the Jesus Dynasty, and this is mentioning something that came up in Tabor's book, and so keep on going.
Well, what was it about Jesus' teaching and his activities that some people found so offensive? Well, of course, there were disputes over the Sabbath and things like that, Jesus' association with sinners. But what we begin to see in that context is Jesus assumes the authority to forgive sins. Who can forgive sins but God alone, people wonder. Well, as Son of Man, Jesus wants to demonstrate that on earth he has authority to forgive sins. Why does he say that? Son of Man on earth? He's talking about the Son of Man in heaven in Daniel 7, who received from the divine throne authority and kingdom. That's an astonishing claim. And then before Caiaphas, the high priest, he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand, coming in the clouds. And you know what's interesting about that? Some critics have said, oh, how can you be seated, which implies being stationary, and yet coming with the clouds, which implies movement? And naturally, some scholars think, well, we must have two divergent traditions clumsily juxtaposed. No, we don't. We are talking about God's throne, which is actually part of a chariot. That's the description in Daniel 7. That's the breathtaking element here. Jesus is saying to Caiaphas, the next time you see me, I will be seated at God's right hand in his chariot throne, thundering through the clouds of heaven, coming in judgment on God's enemies. And you will be numbered among those enemies. And that's why Caiaphas was outraged and tore his robes and cried out blasphemy.
Let's put this on the screen so people can see. In Mark chapter 14, which everybody says is one of the earliest accounts, we read, Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin. The high priest asked him, are you the Christ, it's the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, it's the Son of God? Jesus said, I am. And you will see, here's the Son of Man coming up, the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Now, hook that up with the verse that he was quoting from in Daniel, okay, that the Sanhedrin knew by heart, okay, and here it is. Daniel says, in my vision that night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, that's God, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshiped him. His dominion is not just an earthly dynasty. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So this is the data that we find in the New Testament documents and in the Old Testament scriptures. This is what you're talking about that's at stake here, and you're saying?
That's why Paul says God was in Christ reconciling the world. That's why in the fourth gospel, Jesus says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." All of these traditions go back to Jesus' breathtaking claim that he is the divine Son of Man described in Daniel 7. And that was not lost on Caiaphas. In other words, it was very well understood by his critics, and he was condemned to death for it.
Gary, you've got some other spots in the New Testament that are multiply attested to that talk about Jesus being God.
Yes, first of all, Craig's got some of the best work out here in Mark 14, and I think Son of Man, Son of God, two titles that really, really deserve attention to get it back to Jesus. But I would make the claim that we don't wait decades to see the deed of Jesus. This is not an evolved doctrine. In fact, I would make the statement, might sound a little stunning to some, but I would say that if we use only the pre-Christian hymns, confessions, creeds, the embeddedness, these embedded statements, dozens of them in the New Testament, if we use only those comments, with the possible exception of John, possibly including John, that deserves some discussion, but arguably the highest or nearly the highest Christology can be taken from these embedded sayings alone. So if you go back to the earliest statements about Jesus, I'm talking about what do we do with the text like Romans 10:9, when just a few verses later, it's clear that Lord, in that context, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead. And just 10:13, the Lord is Jehovah, Yahweh from the Old Testament. And so it's pretty clear what Paul's saying here, but that's not Paul. It's a pre-Pauline confession. Romans 1:3 and 4, where the names Lord, Son of God, and Messiah are used in context, and we're told that he gave proof of all these things. He gave witness of all these things by being raised from the dead. I'm thinking you have to do something with Philippians chapter 2. The two bookend verses, Philippians 2:6, with the in the form, the morphe of God, balanced with 2:11, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess, which of course comes from the book of Isaiah, where the same language is not only used of Yahweh, but he says, I will not share my glory with another. And this is attributed to Jesus. And even that Johannine prologue in the first 18 verses, what you do with that, bookend verses, I would suggest like the bookend verses in Philippians chapter 2. You've got the Word was God, and 1:18, the only, in the better manuscripts, the only begotten God in the bosom of the Father. So bookends in John 1, bookends in Philippians 2, Romans 1, Romans 10. You have those early Acts sermon portions where Jesus is given very lofty titles. And I think when you have this combination of what Jesus said about himself and what the earliest church said, some New Testament scholars move these things, these Acts comments even, to the 30s AD. 1 Corinthians 15, to before Paul's conversion. These are early attestations. So when people say, and the implication is almost always there, well, after decades, they copied off the mystery religions, and they began to realize he was a god. First of all, you go to Jesus, and then it's there in the earliest embedded comments that are taken from the early preaching and later recorded in the pages of the New Testament.